first steps into the American narrative not as a veteran of a field, but as a boy of a household calibrated to history. He watches Bunker Hill smoke from the ridge near his father's farm and feels the country's lungs fill with a new kind of breath. Before he is old enough to vote, he's old enough to leave. Ferrying across the Atlantic with a diplomat-father who teaches him that patriotism sometimes looks like dispatches copied by candlelight and sums added carefully at the bottom of each page. Paris, Amsterdam, St. Petersburg. He gathers a grammar of power the way other boys gather heroes, learning that courts conceal boredom inside ceremony, that bankers speak a dialect of caution the bold must learn to translate, that treaties are machines for converting appetite into rules. He keeps a diary because he suspects that the only witness who will never lie to him is the page. The habit becomes a spine. He writes on ships, in rented rooms with thin walls, in ministerial apartments whose windows look down on streets filled with gossip and horses, in inns where thunder walks the roof. He writes angrily, carefully, penitently, and with a severity toward his own motives that would have broken a softer conscience or turned a politician into a cynic. It turns him instead into a craftsman who suspects himself first and then forgives nobody easily, least of all when nobody is himself. Back in Massachusetts, he takes up law with the awkward energy of a mind that likes truths more than clients. The courtroom bores him because it asks him to pretend certainty where he knows the world buys its clarity on installment. The Senate suits him better, for a time, than suits him not at all when party discipline demands that he mistake slogans for reason. He breaks with the Federalists over Jefferson's embargo, not because he worships Jefferson, but because he thinks neutrality without leverage is posture. The party calls it betrayal. He calls it arithmetic. He resigns rather than teach himself the smallness a caucus requires. In the long run, this sets his course. If coalition and conscience collide, he will bruise coalition and wear the bruise publicly. He is not proud of the cost, but he is unwilling to charge it to his principles as if they were a fund created for convenience. Diplomacy saves him from the parochial and confirms him in the national. He learns in St. Petersburg what it means for a great empire to treat time as an ally. He learns in Ghent what it means to end a war bravely without pretending victory found you on the field. The negotiation reads, on paper, like a restoration of the status quo. In the bones, it feels like air returning to lungs that had been holding their breath. He pushes for terms that restore honor through law rather than through theater. He grows old quickly under the strain of detail and the stiffness of British courtesy, and returns home the long way through London with a portfolio that demonstrates how many quiet choices the Republic's survival consists of. Monroe sits him in the chair at state, and in that chair his mind appears whole. The lines he draws are ideas made geography, 49 degrees to the Rockies. Then joint occupation beyond because the continent can be a laboratory without becoming a battlefield. Adams honest as a settlement that uses Spain's fatigue to fix an old quarrel and turn a frontier of excuses into a border of obligations. He writes long memoranda that read like arguments a stranger could agree with. He refuses to confuse elegance with danger. His sentences are cool. His meanings are sharp. He thinks maps are moral instruments and that every new line should be a syllabus. The doctrine that bears another man's name grows out of his mouth because he hates borrowed authority. Britain's Canning flatters, inviting a joint declaration that would make London the chaperone of Washington's virtue. Adams says, speak alone. Do not borrow a fleet to appear brave. Declare that the age of European colonization in this hemisphere is over, not because we are strong enough today to throw everyone out, but because we are resolved enough to insist on a principle that will be truer tomorrow if we say it now. He dresses the thought in sentences that make it sound less like a dare than like a boundary you discover by walking. The beauty of his method is its refusal to shout. He presumes the dignity he demands. He assumes the world will, eventually, get used to the truth if the truth is repeated without hysteria. He is right, and the sentence goes on living as conditions ripen. First on the back of British interest, then under the weight of American growth, later as a doctrine that others will misuse for swagger. In its original register, it is modest, lucid, and exact. By 1824, if the presidency were a matter of resumes, the ballot would be a formality. It is not. 4 men divide the field. Jackson arrives with laurels and a reputation for turning battles into destiny. Crawford with a machine. Clay with the instrument chest of a statesman and the vanity to spend it. Adams with a portfolio of treaties and the defect of being easier to respect than to love. The House chooses from the top 3. Clay casts his influence toward the man who most resembles a cabinet. Adams wins. The country's new democratic temperature invents a phrase designed to rot reputations: corrupt bargain. He is innocent in the sense that counts to him, motive, but the age counts other things. He writes the cleanest inaugural address of his century and refuses to explain himself as if he had traded honor for office. The refusal costs him a chorus he could have used. He accepts the silence like weather and begins to govern. He governs like a magistrate of capability rather than a conjurer of moods. Internal improvements he treats as arteries, not ornaments. A national road is not a ribbon to be cut, but a responsibility filed into a ledger. Canals are not a party's toys, but public works that make regions neighbors. Surveys, charts, and lighthouses are not luxuries, but instruments for reducing the tax of ignorance. He dreams audibly of a national university because he wants the public service to be something more than a carnival of turnstiles. He wants a civil service with a memory independent of elections. He argues for astronomical observatories and calls them lighthouses in the sky because he believes that measuring the heavens will teach the Republic to respect measurement at home. He advances the Smithsonian bequest from rumor to institution, a house of inquiry that belongs to the country's curiosity rather than to any administration's vanity. He insists that weights and measures are moral tools, because a nation that can agree on inches and gallons may yet agree on laws. These proposals do not seduce, they instruct. Instruction sounds, to men newly intoxicated by the feeling that the people are at last inside the house, like a scold. He will not flatter, he will not fire clerks too. Prove that victory has a smell. He will not build a party out of gifts. He tries to build a nation out of standards. The Congress rewards him by preferring theater to calendars. The tariff that 1828 produces, a monument to adjustment made under pressure and to every region's desire to make someone else pay, lands on his desk like a trap. He is not its author. He signs it because he thinks government cannot behave like a man who denies his own arithmetic. The South christens it abomination and begins to rehearse a doctrine that will eventually dress disunion like duty. He knows what he has invited. He keeps writing. He keeps arguing. He keeps signing when the signature is the honest form of responsibility, and vetoing when the form smuggles in a substance he cannot defend. He walks at dawn, swims in the Potomac naked, because water answers in a key the capital never uses, and keeps a diary that berates him for impatience and coldness in the afternoon and forgives him, sometimes, before bed. He loses. Jackson's coalition has music. Adams has a program. He leaves with a courtesy that refuses theater, and then he commits the bravest act of his life. He runs for Congress from his district and wins. A former president takes a House seat and lowers himself into work, as if status were a costume to be hung by the door. He will be there for 17 years, a living rebuke to anyone who thinks honor attaches to chairs rather than to duties. Old man eloquent, they call him, meaning to praise and diminish. He accepts the nickname and makes eloquence into a hammer. The gag rule arrives, the House's attempt to cork the nation's conscience by tabling every petition that mentions slavery. He studies the rules as if they were scripture, and then treats scripture with more mercy than he treats the gag. Day after day he rises, submits, objects, reads the addresses of petitioners into the record, invents procedural maneuvers that make boredom into a weapon, allows censure to approach and withdraw, because his colleagues cannot decide whether martyrdom would make him invincible. He is threatened with expulsion. He refuses to supply shame. He insists that the right to petition is not a fashion, but the people's oldest instrument of self-government. He is not naive about the disease. He understands that slavery will not yield to paper. He also understands that a republic that bleeds its most basic right to be heard will not have the circulation to survive surgery. He widens the front where he can. The District of Columbia, a federal city under federal law, becomes for him the laboratory in which the nation can demonstrate sincerity about its greatest sin, without pretending it can command virtue everywhere. He pushes to abolish the slave trade in the district, an indecency visible beneath the windows through which foreign dignitaries are shown the young nation's manners. He seconds petitions with names of towns that cannot vote for him, and angers men whose endurance for moral pressure is shorter than their speeches about liberty. He is not the country's conscience. He is the country's persistently open door. When the gag finally falls in 1844, it falls because he has taught a chamber to be embarrassed by its own tactics. He counts the day as a victory for procedure and feels, in his bones, that the field beyond procedure remains a plain of sorrow. The Supreme Court discovers that it is a theater and invites him to play the lead in a drama that should have remained a manuscript of law. The Amistad captives sit at the center, and the question is whether men stolen can be forced into slavery by the grace of paperwork. He argues not by tears, but by texts, the Declaration, treaties, statutes, the logic that flows from calling a person a person. His voice is an instrument still, and he plays it for hours with the calm of a man who knows that law is a kind of mercy when it is kept from becoming a costume. He wins a verdict that returns the stolen men to the sea and to Africa, and the country applauds as if a single case could cure a system built out of 1,000 cases multiplied across 1,000 courthouses. He does not smile often. He allows himself this day because the law, for once, behaved like a friend. He is not otherwise a sentimentalist. He opposes Texas annexation, seeing the math of slavery disguised as geography. He calls the Mexican War a sin, marketed as glory, and pays for the sentence with public loathing that does not greatly disturb his sleep. He warns that a war, power might break chains when a crisis ripens, not because he seeks a fight, but because he reads the Constitution as a tool for preserving a people. Not a glass case designed to keep its instruments untarnished while the patient dies. He never sees 1863 with his eyes. He guesses at it with his method. He is not proud of being correct about the ending. He would have preferred to be wrong and to have watched slavery fall by law rather than by cannonade. His domestic life is one long instruction in how genius and goodness do not necessarily make kindness easy. Louisa Catherine brings music to rooms that would otherwise echo. She pays with nerves for his severity and with loyalty for his absences. They bury children together and endure miscarriages, separations, and a city's appetite for gossip. He writes his failures as a husband into the diary with the same candor he uses to write his successes in law. He tries, late, to be gentler. He sometimes succeeds. He does not claim grace he cannot prove. His friendships run hot and cold. He quarrels with men he admires because he will not shorten principles to fit company. He reconciles with old enemies as if the chance to forgive were an exercise set to keep his soul from ossifying. He watches Andrew Jackson transform the office he lost into a plebiscite, and despises the cheapness with which power can be made to look like justice. He does not despair. He writes in the morning and returns in the afternoon to the chamber where the Republic continues its bad habit of treating tomorrow as the garbage can for today's convenience. The Smithsonian becomes a refuge where he can do constructive work untainted by the party's need for spectacle. He shepherds the bequest through pettiness and into brick. He wants a house for curiosity in a city that believes curiosity is either a luxury or a threat. He wins because he knows that institutions are what survive storms. Lighthouses in the sky remains his favorite phrase because it sums up, in 5 words, his belief that science is an instrument of sovereignty and a democrat's tool. Everyone safer because a beacon exists. Everyone improved because a measurement has been agreed upon. He supports the Coast Survey with an attention that would look obsessive if he did not live in a country with a coastline long enough to ruin the unmeasured. He pushes for a standard system of weights and measures, not to satisfy an abstract appetite for order, but to make fraud harder and trust cheaper. He is, absurdly, mocked for these things as if seriousness were a crime. He goes on being serious. Old age cleans his prose. He becomes more dangerous and less patient. He names hypocrisies without the cushion of compliments. He wins, in small rooms, arguments that the newspapers then translate into noise. He loses, in large rooms, votes that the newspapers translate into fate. He responds to both by returning to the desk. He writes letters to children and strangers with a warmth that politics never elicited from him. He advises young men who want to be good to attempt being useful first and to consider goodness a byproduct of discipline. He writes to women who have suffered injury that the law does not know how to name and offers the consolation of attention when he can offer nothing else. He treats his diary as a confessor and a witness. He berates himself for vanity and then, the next day, indulges it by counting enemies like medals. He is fully human, which is why his virtues are believable. He falls at his post. The day is like other days. Petitions, motions, a vote called with the House's usual mixture of ceremony and impatience. He rises to answer and collapses. Colleagues who have called him a crank hold him up with a tenderness that proves at least one half of his argument about the place. Even in a chamber that airs loudly, there are men who still know how to behave when history walks among them. He dies in the Speaker's room, beneath Washington's portrait, which is not a theatrical coincidence so much as a comfort the city can be forgiven for believing in. Outside, the Capitol he helped design as a moral space, streets set to a plan that imagines order can be beautiful, goes on murmuring. The nation he loved more as a project than as a hymn continues its permanent arguments. His diary ends. The weather passes into us. What remains, if you strip away the sentiment and the slander, is a temper and a toolkit. He teaches that office is less than work, and that work continues after offices have been taken away. He teaches that petitions are not inconveniences, but arteries through which the sovereign circulation of the people reaches the heart of government. He teaches that science, treated as public property, dignifies a people, that lighthouses, observatories, surveys, and standards are not expenses but savings, that honor consists less in fury than in fidelity to schedules and texts. He teaches that diplomacy should be written in sentences that survive the minister who composed them, that a boundary made with care is a peace made at wholesale, that a doctrine stated modestly can do more to shape a century than a boast uttered loudly. He teaches that slavery cannot be made decent by silence, and that a chamber that gags its critics is practicing a small treason that, left untreated, grows into a larger one. He teaches, finally, that defeat is not a verdict on virtue, and that the most radical thing a republic can ask of its great men is to sit down among ordinary representatives and keep doing the job. Measured harshly, he fails often as a politician. He misreads the appetite of a generation hungry for spectacle. He speaks in a key that demands attention he has not paid to seduction. He is correct before others are ready, and thereby becomes, in their eyes, insufferable. He refuses to use offices as tips for loyalty, and therefore does not become the kind of patriarch whose descendants inherit posts. He is cold when warmth would bridge differences, and warm when a little coldness would prevent hurt. He knows these things about himself, and cannot, or will not, pretend he can make them otherwise. Measured honestly, he succeeds where success counts. Border stayed arguments and did not become wars. The House regained its right to hear what it wished not to hear. A bequest became a museum. A phrase about the sky turned into an observatory's dome. Kidnapped men went home by law rather than by miracle. The record of a life, kept stubbornly in ink, taught a nation how to watch itself without props. He is not a hero of the convenient kind. He is a hero of the necessary kind, the one who reminds a people that grown governments are built out of schedules, measures, signed pages, rehearsed courtesies, and a refusal to lie about what a principle costs. He admired Washington's steadiness, and Jefferson's sentences, and Hamilton's geometry, and Madison's machinery, and he tried to fuse their gifts without coveting their statues. He fails at fusion. He succeeds at example. In the centuries-long ledger of men who made the Republic sturdier without making it crueler, his column is clean. Read him for comfort if you like the thought that virtue can be severe. Read him for warning if you prefer the thought that the times will always reward decency. He was right about borders, and right about petitions, and right about the danger of shutting a door because the voice outside annoys you. He was wrong about how quickly a country will love a man who brings instruments rather than entertainment. His consolation is that the instruments endure. The river he swam is still there. The observatory still reads the sky. The Smithsonian still speaks the language he wanted the nation to value. Specimens labeled, arguments made, curiosity institutionalized. The doctrine still hems in ambition, even when ambition pretends it cannot hear. So keep him in mind, not as a portrait with a tight mouth, but as a sequence of rooms. A Ghent parlor with frost on the window and stubbornness at the table. A State Department office where a map becomes a sentence. A White House study where a message is drafted that Congress will scoff at and posterity will use. A House chamber where a small old man rises too many times to count, his hand shaking from indignation and age, to insist that a citizen's piece of paper must be received. A courtroom where law wraps itself around the vulnerable like a coat and refuses to budge. A hill where a dome rises to look at the stars and teach a young country that precision is democratic. This is his architecture. Not marble to be admired, but rooms to be used. When we argue now about whether experts belong in government, whether the civil service should remember more than any president's preferences, whether petitions are noise or expression, whether science deserves steady funding even when it does not produce applause, whether boundaries should be made with pens or with shouts, whether a defeated leader owes the country work rather than sulking. His ghost is in the room, not to terrify or to console, but to ask whether we are serious. He would accept a no and write it down with a sigh. He would prefer a yes and offer a calendar. He did not live to see the country's worst hour and best redemption arrive in one weather system. He did not need to live to see it, to be part of it. He had already warned the House that a war might strike off the bonds. He had already taught the House to listen again. He had already built instruments for a government that would need to do surgery while the patient fought back. He had already taught by long example that a man who loses an office can continue to serve without a reduction in dignity. He had already built an observatory in the mind. The rest was time's business. Time has been kinder to him than his colleagues were. Time usually is.